Good afternoon and most welcome to 903. We will today talk about the lectures themselves partly. Well, at least that is going to be my standoff when I'm standing here in the city park of Trädgårdsföreningen. It's a beautiful place, and this could be the first day of spring because I'm starting to see both dandelion and narcissus coming out. It is a lovely day, and this lovely day is a perfect time for retrospection into what we have done before. And it struck me now when we passed 900 lectures. That must be the equivalent of maybe 600-700 hours of lecturing, possibly somewhere in the vicinity of 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 hours of studying and preparing. I think it is possibly more, and also everything that came before. For my instance, started with 2 years in the late 90s, 96 to 98, studying Derrida very intensely. And there, after that, study in university, my own studies, discussions, how about 20-30,000 hours on the telephone, looking in the internet, reading all those books. The book list is immense. But it's a special period I want to get back to here, and that was that instance when we rented a cabin. And this was in the beginning of the series, when the name Heidegger, H, had been established. Heidegger was the goal, and we put a real concisive effort in just Heidegger. And it was at least 100 lectures just with Heidegger. It was immensely. And I have been thinking about that after that, because one thing that is absolutely obvious, were we to have tested afterwards, we would not have scored great. We would not have been able to sort of put a stamp of reality into these things. We can get it up a little bit. We would not be able to execute the knowledge and show it to an external observer, an objective observer, or not even make a decent essay about Heidegger. But I still noticed all that knowledge is still with me, and it's helping me immensely now, especially in the lecture 901 that I made previously. I felt that all I studied in that time is now coming back, but it was never ever explicit, so I could tell anyone what I was knowing, only to a very limited degree. It could even be as little as a tenth I would be able to verbalize or put in paper. And I constantly had a feeling what I could verbalize, what I could talk about, was only a fraction of what I've learned. So I refrained to comment the lectures because I could not talk about them. And I think this is somewhat similar to the general educational idea of owning the knowledge. That it is like a token or a coin. The first thing that came into my mind was actually Paul Feyerabend and his way of showing in history. He's very much into looking where expressions started, their history, and also different properties in reality. And he was looking at the very early coin system. I think Europe had one of the most universal and most efficient coin systems. And it's a little bit, we take the model of the coin and we use it for knowledge. And we had to confirm that we have special knowledge. Isn't that very similar to coin? Because what is the coin? Is it the value itself? No, it's the token for something. It's a substitute. And of course that takes a lot of convincing. The coin system was not put in place until 200-300 years. People in the beginning didn't trust the coin to be valuable, to give them food, work, fur, weaponry and other things. But as time passed, it became established. And in the end, it was almost like it was interchangeable with value. But it never is. Even to this day, coins are not value themselves. I think inflation goes to show that pretty clearly. And actually, it has happened many times in history that the whole coin system fell over and became bankrupt. Two well-known examples is what happened to the mark in the 1920s. It lost all its value, and you would have to pay up on the equivalents 100 million just to get a loaf of bread. So there is a danger in confusing the token, the sign, so to speak, of knowledge with knowledge itself. I am not criticizing hereby the educational system's aspect of testing knowledge. This is not my point. But do not confuse the two things. They are not at all similar. Actually, they are completely dissimilar. A change in knowledge can have no effect whatsoever in the token for knowledge. And also the opposite holds. We can learn the tokens by heart without having the depth. And I think today, and this is what I will refer to as technological knowledge, because it's similar to the evolution during, I would say, very late Renaissance and early industrial era, maybe somewhere in the beginning of the 18th century, when we start to mass produce things and we start to think all things are equal to a greater degree. We did not have equal things before to that extent. When I went to the British Industry Museum of British Industry in London many years ago, I realized keenly that we went from having maybe 3 or 4 standardized objects. I think one of the most well-known standardized objects was the Roman amphora, and also the Roman brick. They were marvels as standardization. But compared to what happened in the first decades of the 18th century, it's nothing. All of a sudden, we had thousands of similar objects. Combs, sweaters, pants, porcelain, cutlery, things for the farms, everything looked exactly similar, and it was interchangeable. You see, there is an interchangeability in between the tokens, but not in between what they do. It's two different aspects. And during the technical revolution, the industrial revolution, a misunderstanding came to form. An easy misunderstanding to fall into, but very hard to get out. Once they're confused, they become almost inseparable. We cannot make a clear difference between the token and what it stands for. And in many cases that's necessary. Not all cases, but in many cases. I have a horrible example myself. A friend of mine who went to the dentist. It was actually not far from this city park in the city center of Gothenburg. It was an exclusive dentistry and a renowned dentist. He had all the tokens. He exceeded in his knowledge, token-wise. So my friend recommended the dentist to his family, and they recommended the dentist to friends and even only acquaintances. It took 10 years until the problem started. It turned out the dentist did not have skill enough to be able to perform. And that's another matter. You can still take an exam in dentistry and still fall through. It is unusual, but it could happen. And then it turned out an explosion of problems in this group that used the same dentist. We need to be aware of the difference, because otherwise we destroy knowledge as it is. And I think today we acquire the idea that knowledge is something you sort of own. It's a sealed thing, it's a stamp. And it's okay with titles and everything, but don't confuse the two. They're both nice, but they are different things. They're actually so different as this thermos compared to the ground I'm standing on, having nothing in common in some instances. And this technological method or idea of learning has been mumbled in a way. There is a mumbling, confusion of things. And we start thinking to a great extent that we own knowledge. It is something almost external to our own being. It is a little token that we keep in a safe somewhere. And you see, here we have some uncanny relationships to, of course, the representational idea. They are related, but there are also interesting differences. One thing that is troublesome, which I will bring up now in this paragraph, just let me sniff a little bit on this. I would say one thing that gets established, it's that if we think the token is the real McCoy, the thing that we are looking for and want, we start instead to stamping out coin. Stamping out coins means that you have a special instrument, you put it on a piece of metal, and then you use a hammer. And then you get a distinction. A coin surrounded by emptiness. And the stancing make superfluous material go away. That stamping process takes away knowledge. We use it in the wrong way around, so to speak. We need to acquire knowledge first, then possibly we can have the tokens if they suit our specific subjective purpose or the objective purpose of the school. But it cannot be the other way around. That is immensely important. And all of a sudden in this technological knowledge, we get the situation that we start stamping out what we know and don't know. And I started almost the same thing in this Heidegger series, way back when we were living in the cabin. I start reflecting on what I know, and I can only catch the conscious parts, the ones I couldn't explain. And that actually diminished my efforts in going through the series. It took away a lot of energy. I didn't see the results I think my whole system needed. Yes, 2 episodes ago I got the reward, like the mental reward, but it was always already there since we did the hundreds. No doubt about that. I feel it in my whole system. I cannot explain everything. I cannot put it into coins. I wouldn't even be able to put it all down in writing, but it's much more extensive. And I also feel I can access better if I don't use the model of the coin. All of a sudden, my knowledge becomes more accessible. It doesn't have to go through this cumbersome, tiring process of naming and renaming, and it doesn't any longer take away what's around the coin, the negative space. And now you could call this an invitation to open your arms to not knowing. This persistence on knowing, it's almost by being interrogated by a tourist maybe here. It happened to me many years ago. He was German. He insisted on questioning. And in the end, I did not know myself. This is an extreme example. But I would say the same thing happens within the educational system and within the students themselves. They don't know how much information, knowledge, juicy details they get, and they tend to undervalue, and it gets stuck somewhere in the system because of this currency idea of knowledge, like something to be owned. Once more, of course, we have the idea of ownership, the reflective consciousness of Richard E. Lind, and other things we mentioned. But this has also a more serious side to it. How can we tell what is an existing knowledge, that I really know it? What method do we have for that? Actually, in technology, it's not that difficult. If it works, it works. But if I construct this method vaguely on what I think is just technological knowledge, which is always different from machine to machine, from detail to detail, and I take a general concept of that, that is a crude generalization. And what does crude generalization do? They take away knowledge. They take away all the details, the fractal intricacy that is knowledge. Both on my side, doing this procedure automatically, but also on the side of knowledge itself. I put the inflation into action. And for every time I do it, there is a tendency that it becomes less accessible. I won't delve into this lecture, I will return to this, but I am quite certain this also explains why we today have so much memory loss. One of the most common complaints today is that there is a lack of memory. People simply do not remember. Well, this could serve like a really good explanation why. It's very hard to catch those isolated, contextless things that we, from the onset, generalize and say they're all the same. That sort of blocks everything out, puts it on a distance, puts it under the covering shield of generality, of universality, gets just stamped, like 1 crown, $1, €1, you name it, they all look the same. They hide the fact that there is real value behind. This is turning the whole process upside down, and it does severe damage. It hinders us from entering knowledge. It hinders us to access memories, things that should be living for us, that place their own life polysemically, having different aspects, and having this most important fractal aspect. Because if we flatten everything out, we lose the depth of knowledge. And this is sharing a lot also of what Susie Frober talks about fractal time. By turning time into currency, minute, hour, day, week, month, and going about the wrong way. You could do the same thing with time, and most people do today. That causes stress. This doesn't cause stress. This causes crowdedness and unnecessary divisions that take away knowledge you already should have been able to access. By instituting large areas of yourself that you deem to be not knowledge. So if I were to explain what Heidegger says, I had to take away from my own knowledge to explain to someone else. That should not be necessary. If you part the processes, you can do both things, either simultaneously or at different instances, but don't confuse them. As long as you realize your whole being knows a lot more than that little ego consciousness can easily reach, that in itself is a relaxation of this mind tension. And my guess is, if you try really to hit your memory system, hit your brain, give me that memory, it will not produce. It's like a donkey. Kicking it won't make it move. Gentleness, openness will have memory accessible for you. And I realize now what this memory of the man who was fairly uneducated told me like 20 years ago. He never ever forgot anything in his life. And I think that is possible for most people. And then on top of that, you can add training, education. You're not losing anything. So the openness is like, in time you get more time if you enter fractality. And you can still keep your clock. You can still be in time for meetings. You can still plan to take a shower for 10 minutes or take a walk for 35 minutes and a half and have school classes for 40 minutes. But don't start in that alley, so to speak. Start with what time offers you. The same should go for knowledge. And I know this is how knowledge once upon a time did work. It was much more openness. And just talking about these things, and I also felt during the day here, it is that I feel more access to knowledge as I enter this. It's like invisible boundaries sort of disappears and knowledge is entering instead. And sometimes I feel it's ludicrous. How would I have to sort of cannibalize in my own knowledge to create these coin-like structures every time I spoke about what I know? That doesn't serve any purpose. It puts a strain on the system, and actually it takes away energy from the very thing. This openness, letting space come into knowledge, and not being, dividing, existence, all those things. Let it be both knowledge and non-knowledge, and you will understand you have a lot more. You get more of everything. It's like we're shying away from not knowledge, and we want to eradicate it to have this absolute presence of pure knowledge. Well, what am I talking about? Of course, I'm talking about the gestalt of the Enlightenment period. It did serve its purpose, maybe, to some extent, but we should not get stuck there. There is no need for banner words and shouting outside the Bastille for enlightenment in that way. This is sort of too aggressive mood in being, especially towards yourself, because it doesn't produce memory and it doesn't produce knowledge. This is actually an invitation to knowledge, opening up the text by accepting both polarities, both what it is and what it is not, and they can both be there at the same time, none of them excluding anyone. And you will notice, and this is really odd, an extra sharpness than when you go about to make a definition. You will also notice, I already noticed this, a sharpness in thinking. The thoughts themselves, by accepting what they are not thinking, not awareness, not absence, they get broader, less crowded. There is less urge to produce. I am quite certain, and there are good indications from neurology, that this monetary view on knowledge has caused strain on modern day students, because what is erupting now with a force never seen before is this learning incapacities or disabilities. For instance, dyslexia, which is very hard to pronounce as well. Why did I choose such a word for people who can't pronounce properly or read properly? Sorry about my laughter. It wasn't meant that way. No, dyslexia, lack of focus, these are all things that are progressing in a speed that is unmatched by anything else in modern educational history. I think this stress it puts on the students to go about things in the wrong way, and after, when they can't handle it, I think maybe 67-70% can still handle it. I could, but I felt the strain. I do remember that, and I felt there was a better way of going about things. But those who couldn't, when they didn't catch their memories, when they didn't catch their knowledge by this crude method of cutting out things that were supposed to be present, not absent knowledge, that method made the whole case much worse. And all of a sudden they started to spiraling. And this is a process that can go really fast. That is what happens with dyslexia. But other learning disabilities take longer time to develop, but they are not there pure and perfect at the onset. They need to be sort of pushed into coming forward, and that push, I think, is in the educational system. And of course it'd be worse if the teacher and maybe the whole system has the same confusion. I mentioned that before. A big investigation made in the late 90s where Edward de Bono was one of the people who were pushing it and also paid money for it, show that 90% of people in academia think that you come to the new by the explanations of the old, by the logic, by old reasoning you can reach the new. We know that, and we've known it for maybe 40 years. That is absolutely impossible. That is going the other way around. Because if I coin my knowledge, it's also about wanting to tell someone else, either to educate or just to communicate. And that will in itself diminish, make it smaller, more pear-shaped. Everything becomes pear-shaped in the end. It's an English saying. But it's okay, because it's just about communication. But if I do that to myself, and if we are doing that in the school hall and everywhere else, that will cause damage. We have confused what should come first and what is the system of explaining to someone else or reasoning or arguing, which are completely other tools. I don't think anybody does any mistakes when it comes to gardening. And I can show a little bit of the area. I think they start the right way directly. They start with cutting the trees. You do that in February, and then you put on the mold on the earth, and then you take away weed, such stuff, and then you water, and then you give nutrition. That has to be in a certain way. Otherwise the plants won't grow. If we start with a token, we give wrong hints to the whole system. We give hints that are bad for the individual. This is not how we acquire knowledge. And today this is completely self-evident knowledge within neurology, but it's not out there yet at any measure. I did a Googling late last night. I could find very little evidence that these news are coming out to the educational system. We learn as a whole, and what the ego has consciously or what we communicate is just a fraction of that, and it's shaped differently. It's shaped in a more universal way. Otherwise I wouldn't be able to communicate what I know, because this is just too expanded and fractal. I can communicate it, but I need to take my whole system in calculation. That's why we still have proper studies with people that are live in front of young pupils, because he or she has to be there in person. A lot comes from different ways. The environment needs to be good. You can't sit in a darkened 18th century English study hall with only candles. That wouldn't work today. We need to help education, not hamper it by these ideas. Yes, I know technology is fantastic, but don't copy it right off just because it's so fantastic. And the temptation is not very hard to understand, but it does great disservice to knowledge as such. And I think this is going to be healed once neurology comes out to the foreplay, when it comes to the foreground. And this is bound to happen rather quickly, because the evidence is just too out there. But maybe I could help a little bit by this lecture, like putting the banner for letting knowledge be knowledge, even those darkened areas you think are not knowing. And let absence into your heart, because that will also let in presence. Another very marvelous character of knowledge. I think I round up there. It's time enough. Say thank you very much from Trädgårdsföreningen, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.